It is just after midnight on the 28th of February 1942, and the English Channel is pitch black and violent. The crew of a Royal Navy motor torpedo boat is not hunting U-boats tonight. They are not laying mines, nor are they searching for downed pilots. Their mission is stranger, quieter, and arguably more dangerous. They are carrying a single, unassuming wooden box lashed to the deck with canvas straps. Inside is not a new cannon or a prototype bomb, but a contraption that looks like a child's science project, a collection of brass fittings, copper wire, and a small glowing valve. As the boat cuts across the black water toward the occupied coast of France, a young RAF technician, barely 22 years old, adjusts a dial. He is about to commit an act of technological warfare. If he is captured, he has been instructed to destroy the device with a hammer and then throw himself into the sea. This is the first combat test of a secret so profound that for decades after the war, its very name remained classified. This is the story of the cavity Magnetron, the British gadget that reached across the channel, reached into the cockpits of the Luftwaffe, and with a single pulse of microwave energy, turned the Nazis' most advanced radar into a blind, useless heap of scrap metal. To understand why a handful of brass valves and magnets mattered more than 1,000 Spitfires, you have to understand the terror of German radar in 1941. The chain-home network that saved Britain during the Battle of Britain was a giant, clumsy system. It used long-wave radio frequencies, roughly 1.5 kilometers wide. It could spot a formation of bombers coming from France, but it was utterly useless at finding a single ship, a periscope, or a lone aircraft at low altitude. The Germans, however, had solved that problem. Their Würzburg and Freya radar systems operated on much shorter wavelengths, roughly half a meter. This allowed them to guide night fighters directly onto British bombers with terrifying precision. The statistics were a slaughter. In the winter of 1940, Bomber Command was losing nearly 5% of its aircraft on every raid over Germany. At that rate, a bomber crew's life expectancy was measured in weeks, not months. The existing solution was electronic jamming, throwing up clouds of metallic foil, known as window, to confuse the German screens. But window was a blunt instrument. It blinded the enemy, yes, but it also blinded your own pathfinders. Worse, the Germans could simply switch frequencies. The problem seemed mathematically impossible. To jam a Würzburg radar effectively, you needed a transmitter of immense power at exactly the right frequency. But to generate that power at such a short wavelength, conventional radio valves melted. They literally glowed red and fused into glassy slag. The engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment on the cliffs of Swanage were stumped. They needed a source of microwave energy 1,000 times more powerful than anything that existed. The challenge was impossible until a pair of physicists at the University of Birmingham had a bizarre idea. Their names were John Randall and Harry Boot, and in the winter of 1940, in a secret laboratory that smelled of solder and anxiety, they built something completely different. The conventional approach was to build bigger valves. Randall and Boot went smaller, much smaller. They took a solid block of copper, roughly the size of a cricket ball, and machined a series of intricate resonant cavities into its core. Then they suspended a central cathode inside this block and placed it between two powerful magnets. When they switched it on, something miraculous happened. Electrons boiled off the hot cathode did not simply flow to the anode. Caught between the magnetic field and the electric field, they formed a spinning, whirling cloud, like a miniature hurricane. As this electron hurricane passed the openings of the copper cavities, it induced a high-frequency oscillation.
But this was not the ragged, weak signal of a conventional valve. This was coherent, powerful, and incredibly short. The first cavity magnetron produced microwave pulses at 9 centimeters wavelength with a power of 400 watts. Within weeks, they had boosted that to 10 kilowatts, 10,000 watts. The Germans, using conventional technology, were struggling to get more than a few hundred watts at that frequency. To use an analogy your grandfather would understand, if German radar was a candle, the landing light of a jumbo jet. The problem of melting valves was solved because there were no delicate glass envelopes to melt. The entire resonator was a single block of solid copper, machined to tolerances thinner than a human hair. It could dissipate heat through its own mass, allowing it to run at power levels that would have turned any conventional radio valve into a puddle. The manufacturing was a nightmare. The team at the General Electric Company's research laboratories at Wembley had to invent entirely new techniques for machining and brazing. They used pure silver for the joints. Records suggest that by the end of 1941, fewer than 100 operational magnetrons existed. Each one was a hand-built miracle, taking a skilled technician nearly a week to assemble. The secrecy was absolute. The device was referred to only as the cavity. The workers who built it did not know what it did. They were told they were making parts for a new type of aircraft ignition system. But a weapon that exists only in a laboratory is useless. It must be carried to the enemy. And this is where the story becomes genuinely cinematic. The British did not put the magnetron in a bomber. They put it in a small, high-speed launch. The concept was called moonshine, later refined into a system known as carpet. The idea was breathtakingly simple. You build a small airborne transmitter using the magnetron, you fly it directly at the German radar site, and you broadcast back to the Germans their own signal, amplified 1,000-fold and shifted slightly in frequency. To the German operator, his screen did not show a single blip. It showed a solid wall of white noise, a blizzard of false returns that swamped his receiver and made it impossible to distinguish a real aircraft from the ghost echoes. On the night of 28 February 1942, during the infamous Channel Dash, when the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau slipped through the English Channel, the first operational magnetron jammers were rushed to the coast. They were too late to stop the dash, but the RAF crews who operated them reported a strange, silent victory. As they turned their dials, they could see the German coastal radar stations on their own monitoring equipment. The German signals were sharp, precise, deadly. Then the British technician would throw a switch. The magnetron would whine as it spun up, and instantly the German signal would vanish, replaced by a flat, featureless hiss. One operator later described it as turning off a torch by dropping a bedsheet over the lens. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe radar operators is harder to document, but the operational logs speak volumes. By mid-1943, the loss rate of Bomber Command had fallen from 5% to just over 2%. The German night fighters, once guided by the invisible hand of Würzburg, were now flying blind, forced to rely on their own eyes in the dark. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now you might ask, did the Germans have anything like this? The answer is no, not even close. The Germans had excellent conventional radar. Their engineers were brilliant, arguably superior in many fields of electronics, but they had dismissed the cavity magnetron as a theoretical dead end. They were working on a device called the Rundfunk, a multi-cavity design, but they were years behind. By the time the German intelligence captured a downed British bomber in 1943 and found the mangled remains of a magnetron, they were stunned. German reports described it as an absolute sensation. They immediately copied the design, but it was too late. The Allies had already moved on to even shorter wavelengths, 3 centimeters, then 1 centimeter. The German copies were crude, heavy, and produced in tiny numbers. The American equivalent, developed at MIT's radiation laboratory after the British shared the magnetron in the Tizard mission of 1940, was excellent, but it was a direct copy of the British design. The fundamental invention, the resonant cavity structure, was purely British. And it was not just for jamming. The magnetron became the heart of the world's first practical airborne intercept radar, the AI Mark 8, which allowed RAF night fighters to hunt German bombers in complete darkness. It became the core of the H-2S ground mapping radar, which allowed pathfinders to see German cities through cloud cover. And it became